What did a home in ancient China really look like 2,000 years ago? For many people today, the image is either too grand or too empty. Some imagine elegant palaces with painted beams and sweeping roofs. Others picture little more than crude huts of mud and straw. But neither image by itself brings us close enough, because the truth of domestic life in Han China was more complex, more intelligent, and far more human. What did it feel like to pass through the gate of such a house at dawn? What stood under your feet? What did the walls carry, hide, and protect? How did one courtyard hold labor, sleep, cooking, storage, family discipline, and ancestral memory all at once? And how could the difference between one roof and another, one jar and another, one layer of plaster and another, decide whether a household faced the year with stability or fear? When we step carefully into these houses, we do not merely study architecture. We enter a world where timber, earth, water, smoke, grain, and hierarchy were joined so tightly that the structure of the house became a structure for life itself. Much of what we know comes not from standing homes, because timber and earth rarely survive, but from archaeology and from the detailed pottery house models placed in Han tombs, where the dead were furnished with images of the living world. The first thing to understand is that a Han house was often less a single room than a small universe arranged around enclosure. Archaeological models show walled residential compounds with a gate, inner courtyards, side buildings, storage structures, animal pens, and in wealthier cases even towers rising above the main house. Some of these pottery models preserve details that real houses lost long ago: wooden post and lintel construction rendered in clay, lattice windows, projecting balconies, bracket sets beneath the eaves, and tiled roofs with pronounced ridges. This alone changes the modern imagination. A home 2,000 years ago in China was not always an exposed cabin standing helpless in the open. Very often it was a protected inward-facing environment. The house did not begin with the street. It began after the wall. That difference matters. To live inside an enclosed compound was to live with a clear separation between the outer world and the family's inner domain. Dust, noise, officials, strangers, trade, danger, obligation, and rumor existed outside. Inside stood a space ordered for those who belonged there. Even when a dwelling was modest, the architectural instinct was already visible. The home was something gathered inward, shielded, layered, and made legible through entry, threshold, and enclosure. In larger households, that inwardness could become imposing. In simpler ones, it remained practical. But in both, the house was not just a shelter from rain. It was a boundary around a way of living. And yet China was too large for any single house form to speak for the entire empire. In the wetter south, in lands more vulnerable to dampness and flooding, raised houses on stilts were known. In other places, especially across the north and central plains where Han political culture was strongest, homes more often followed an earth and timber logic. Walls of mud, clay, rough stone, or plastered infill, wooden structural members, and roofs that might be thatched in humbler settings or tiled in more substantial ones. That is why any honest reconstruction must resist the temptation to flatten ancient China into one neat picture. A peasant family in a wet southern region, an artisan household near a city, a prosperous landowning lineage in the north, and the estate of a local notable did not inhabit the same built world. But across those differences, one theme remained constant. The house was designed not around individual privacy, but around climate, labor, storage, and family continuity. Modern people often ask how many rooms there were, where the bedroom was, where the living room was, where the dining room was, as though every home in every age naturally divides life into specialized spaces. Han houses remind us that this is not how most human beings have lived. For them, the pressing questions were not whether a room had a name, but whether grain stayed dry, water stayed close, smoke escaped, roofs held through rain, and the household remained ordered enough to endure the seasons. Look down now, because in a house like this, the ground told the truth before the walls did. The courtyard was not a decorative void, it was a worked surface. Underfoot there was packed earth, sometimes hard from repeated compaction, sometimes soft after rain, sometimes dusty in dry weather, always vulnerable to weather and always under care. This was a world in which pounded earth was not a poor substitute for real construction. It was one of the ancient building technologies of China, used in platforms, foundations, and major structures, because compacted earth could become remarkably durable. That same logic shaped domestic surfaces. The yard had to be swept. Mud had to be managed. Water had to be directed away from walls. Children crossed it. Grain could be spread there. Tools were carried across it. Chickens scratched it. Shadows moved over it with the passing of the day. If the courtyard was neglected, the whole house felt it. Dust entered rooms. Moisture crept toward thresholds. Insects multiplied. A yard was not empty space between buildings. It was the working heart that linked them. That is why the center of the home often remained open to the sky. In that exposed rectangle, light entered, air circulated, water fell, labor unfolded, and the invisible pulse of the household became visible. The sky itself was part of the architecture. The sun crossed overhead, and with it, the entire rhythm of the day. Now lift your eyes from the ground to the frame of the house itself. One of the deepest differences between many traditional Chinese buildings and the way modern people imagine walls is this. The wall was not always the chief bearer of weight. Timber did the great work. Posts, beams, and roof supports carried the structure, while wall sections often filled the spaces between. That meant the life of the house depended on carpentry as much as masonry. Han models and surviving evidence show the importance of wooden columns, beams, bracket sets, and projecting eaves. Even when walls were made from mud, plaster, brick, or other earthen material, the roof's burden often went into timber pillars rather than directly into the wall mass. This made houses at once resilient and vulnerable. Resilient because timber framing allowed a flexible architectural language with porches, overhangs, balconies, and recognizable bays. Vulnerable because wood ages, cracks, warps, burns, rots, and demands care. A roof beam was not just a piece of material, it was a future responsibility. A household with sound timber possessed more than a better house. It possessed time. A household forced to repair green wood, reused members, or cheaper structural elements lived closer to anxiety. When we imagine daily life in such a home, we should not imagine architecture as a fixed background. People watched their houses. They listened to them. They noticed new creaks, new leaks, new gaps, new drafts. The building was alive in the household's attention because if one part failed, the problem would not remain isolated for long. Above that timber frame stretched the roof, and the roof may have been the clearest sign of social difference from a distance. Archaeological reconstructions and Han models show straight gable roofs, wide eaves, and rows of tiles with circular ends in more substantial houses. Yet other ancient homes were roofed with thatch or simpler organic coverings. To modernize, a roof is often reduced to style. In the ancient world, a roof was fate. A good roof cast deep shade in summer, threw rainwater away from the walls, and reduced the assault of weather on the fragile meeting point between earth and timber. A poor roof turned every season into a test. When the summer sky broke open, the family heard the truth immediately. Rain did not fall on abstraction. It struck tile, reed, straw, wood, and packed earth. It exposed weak joints, loose sections, and every place where care had failed or had become unaffordable. Under a well-made roof, the sound of rain could remain a sound. Under a compromised one, it became a threat moving steadily inward. And so the eaves mattered. Their shadow mattered. Their projection mattered. The line of dripping water mattered. Even the angle of the roof mattered because it governed whether the walls below would endure another season. In some homes, the roof meant dignity and relief. In others, it meant endless repair. A household that could keep water out was already wealthier than it first appeared. But the house did not truly reveal itself from the roofline alone. You had to enter the courtyard to understand how life moved. This open center was not only where light entered, it was where the family's labor became visible. Movement converged there. Someone passed carrying water. Someone else shook out cloth. Grain could be aired. Tools could be set down and picked up again. A child might chase a chicken across the packed ground, while an older member of the household called from the shade. In richer compounds, the courtyard could be larger, more ordered, more strongly framed by surrounding buildings. In humbler ones, it could be tight, uneven, and plain. But in either case, it was not dead space. It was the breathing interval between rooms. the place where indoors and outdoors met without fully becoming one another. In a climate-controlled modern home, the transition from room to room is often barely felt. In a Han house, that transition remained elemental. To cross the courtyard was to cross light, air, temperature, smell, and weather. You knew whether the day was cold, humid, windy, dusty, or bright, because the architecture did not seal you away from reality. It mediated reality. That is why the courtyard has such emotional power in the history of Chinese architecture. It was not simply a formal principle. It was the house's exposed conscience, the one place where heaven, labor, and family routine touched the same ground. Near that working center, water became one of the household's most important daily concerns. Han tombs contain well models so often that they make a quiet but unmistakable statement. A proper home was hard to imagine without a reliable source of water nearby. Some wellhead models even preserve the framing above the opening, the windlass or pulley arrangement, and the vessel set beside it. This tells us more than the existence of a hole in the ground. It tells us that drawing water was built into the architecture of life. Water had to be lifted, carried, stored, rationed, and guarded from contamination. It was needed for drinking, cooking, washing, cleaning, and often for animals as well. Every bucket drawn required labor. Every spilled vessel had a cost. Every extra trip to the well consumed strength and time. That is why the placement of a well mattered so deeply. A well near the house was not a convenience in the modern sense. It was a reduction in human burden repeated day after day, season after season. And because so many Han funerary models include wells among the essential equipment of life, we can glimpse how ancient people themselves ranked its importance. A household could not remain orderly for long without water close at hand. Even the visual language of the wellhead, with its roofed frame and stored container, suggests a small architecture within the architecture, a fixed point around which necessity, repetition, and household discipline revolved. Step now from the courtyard into the interior, and one modern assumption falls away almost at once. You would not enter a world organized around chairs, sofas, and tall furniture. For much of early Chinese history, life was lived at what scholars call the mat level. People commonly sat on mats or low platforms rather than on high chairs in the later sense. That single fact changes the body language of the house. The floor or low-raised surface was not an afterthought. It was where conversation happened, where food was set, where work was done, where people rested, and where the distinction between sitting, reclining, and sleeping could remain fluid. This does not mean the interior was bare in the way modern people sometimes romanticize simplicity. It means the logic of furnishing was different. A woven mat, a low table, a platform, a chest, a screen, a basin, a lamp, a storage jar. These could shape an entire room more decisively than bulky furniture does today. The body stayed closer to the ground, and architecture responded accordingly. Openings, low surfaces, and lines of sight felt different in a world not built around chair height. Even social relations were affected. To sit lower, to kneel, to recline on mats or low platforms, to approach elders or guests in a body posture closer to the floor, these were not neutral habits. They helped create a domestic atmosphere in which humility, composure, and order were enacted through everyday movement. A Han house was not only seen, it was inhabited through the discipline of the body. That interior world was filled with objects, but not with excess. By the Western Han, bowls, plates, basins, jars, and similar household wares were produced in great quantity for daily use, and the same categories appear again and again in tomb offerings because they were regarded as basic necessities of life. Pottery carried much of this burden, but pottery was not the whole story. The Han period was also a great age of lacquer. Lacquered utensils, containers, and even some pieces of furniture were not merely luxurious curiosities. They played an important role in everyday material culture, especially in wealthier households that could afford more refined versions of common needs. This means that the domestic interior of ancient China was not colorless. The mind should not imagine only brown mud, gray clay, and rough wood. In a prosperous house, there may have been the dark gleam of lacquer, the polished curve of a cup, the painted surface of a box, the red or black finish of an object carefully protected from moisture and wear. Such things mattered because they lay exactly at the meeting point between utility and status. Everyone needed vessels. Not everyone could possess graceful ones. Everyone had to store food. Not everyone could store it in beautiful or well-crafted containers. The house thus became a silent record of what a family could preserve, replace, or display. Wealth did not need a speech. It could sit quietly in the hand as a well-made bowl. And then there was the stove. No element in the house joined survival and meaning more directly. Han tombs regularly include models of stoves, and some museum examples preserve details such as multiple cooking pots, burner openings, and even a chimney-like form suggesting a wood-burning installation. The stove was where raw grain became nourishment, where water was heated, where the day's labor began before sunrise and continued long after other tasks had ended. Smoke, heat, ash, steam, and smell gathered there. This was not the bright, sterilized kitchen of modern imagination. It was a place of fire management, fuel economy, and constant attentiveness. A badly placed or poorly vented stove blackened walls and irritated lungs. A good one made the difference between strain and rhythm. And in China, the stove carried more than practical importance. Scholarship on Han material culture shows that this period was crucial in the development and integration of the kitchen god belief with the household stove. In other words, the place where food was made was not merely technical. It was moralized, watched, and woven into the spiritual imagination of the family. The hearth did not belong only to appetite. It belonged to order. What happened there sustained the body, but it also reflected the condition of the household itself. If the well was the source of life drawn upward, the stove was the point where life was transformed, shared, and judged. From the stove, the logic of storage becomes easier to understand. In an agricultural household, food security was never abstract. It sat in jars, bins, sacks, granaries, and storehouses. That is why Han tomb models include not only houses and wells, but granaries and storage buildings as essential parts of the domestic world. Grain had to be protected from moisture, mold, insects, rodents, theft, and simple misfortune. A sealed storehouse was not just a storage room. It was the household's defense against time. The difference between having reserves and having almost none was the difference between patience and panic. A family with grain could survive a bad week. A family with deeper reserves could survive a bad season. A family with proper storage could wait. A family without it was immediately vulnerable to weather, market shifts, taxation, and crop failure. This is why domestic architecture and economy cannot be separated. Walls, jars, bins, floors, and roof quality all fed into the same question. Could this house hold tomorrow inside it? When we see a model granary, a storehouse, or sacks of grain represented in Han funerary art, we are seeing more than agricultural detail. We are seeing the architecture of anxiety. Human beings have always wanted homes that can carry them across uncertainty. In Han China, that hope often took the shape of a sealed container, a dry chamber, and a roof that did not betray what was stored below it. This helps explain another truth modern viewers sometimes miss. Ancient houses were not designed primarily to maximize privacy. They were designed to sustain continuity. Several generations might move through the same compound. Age, authority, and role mattered. Even where the architecture was simple, the social order inside it was not. The elderly, the married couple who headed the household, children, dependents, servants in wealthier homes, workers, guests, and animals, did not all stand on the same level of importance, even if they lived in close proximity. The larger the compound, the more this order could be expressed through position, layering, and access. But even in a small home, hierarchy did not disappear. It was carried in who rose first, who served, who received, who sat where, who spoke before whom, and who crossed which threshold with confidence. The Han world was deeply shaped by ideals of filial conduct and social role, and the architecture of the house naturally reflected that moral atmosphere. A household could not survive if every person behaved as an isolated individual. The compound demanded mutual visibility. It also demanded restraint. Sounds traveled. Labor was seen. Disorder was noticed. A child learned quickly that the house remembered behavior because the family did. In that sense, the domestic space itself became an educator. The walls did not lecture, but they enforced proximity, rank, and repetition until those things became character. Even the least glamorous parts of the household reveal how practical and unsentimental this world could be. Han funerary models include pigsties and even combined pigsty latrine arrangements, a striking reminder that sanitation, animal keeping, and agriculture formed part of one connected cycle. To a modern observer, such an arrangement can feel shocking, even crude. But in an ancient farming economy, waste was not merely refuse to be hidden as far away as possible. It could become manure, and manure meant fertility. The house, the pen, the yard, and the field were not separate moral universes. They were connected systems of survival. This does not make the arrangement pleasant. It makes it intelligible. Ancient people were often far more direct than modern people about the material conditions of life, because they could not afford to romanticize them away. A household that raised pigs, handled waste, and returned nutrients to the land was participating in a logic of reuse older than modern disgust. That logic had smells, risks, labor, and no illusion of comfort. But it also had efficiency. And when Han tomb models preserve such details, they do something extraordinary. They refuse to let later generations imagine the ancient home as only noble, clean, ceremonial, and refined. They insist on the full truth. A real home had food, smoke, mud, water, noise, animals, labor, and bodily need. To understand ancient China, one must have the honesty to let all of those enter the picture together. By now, the deeper pattern becomes clear. What separated households was often not the presence or absence of the basic elements, but the quality of those elements. Many families had walls. Not all had durable ones. Many had a roof. Not all had tiled protection with sound timber beneath. Many had vessels. Not all had well-made jars or lacquered wares. Many had a courtyard. Not all had enough space, drainage, labor, or enclosure to keep it clean and useful through the seasons. This is why poverty in the ancient world so often hides inside sameness. From far away, one house resembles another. Up close, the differences become merciless. In one compound, grain remains dry, smoke is controlled, water is near, and repairs are manageable. In another, damp creeps in, the roof weakens, storage fails, and every season consumes what little the family has. Han tomb models themselves show the contrast. Elaborate multi-story manor houses with enclosed courtyards, dogs, towers, and careful detailing were buried with the wealthiest members of society, while more modest structures speak of smaller means. This teaches us something vital. Wealth was not only visible in ornament, it was visible in reduced vulnerability. The truly rich household was not merely the one that looked impressive. It was the one that could absorb bad weather, hold reserves, and keep the future from becoming an emergency. Ancient architecture was never just about beauty. It was about the degree to which beauty had been purchased through stability. Now imagine the house at night. The courtyard darkens first. Then the walls seem taller because the sky above them deepens into black. Interior light is limited. Han Mingqi include lamps among the essential goods of life, which tells us enough. Darkness was a real domestic force. In a world without electric certainty, the lamp did not merely create atmosphere. It defended movement. A weak flame beside stored objects, mats, vessels, and thresholds made the difference between ordinary passage and accident. Shadows thickened around beams, jars, and doorways. Sound became sharper. The creak of wood, the settling of rafters, the soft noise of an animal in its pen, the closing of a door, a cough from another room, the low conversation that ended the day. These would have filled the house more fully than light did. And here one more modern illusion should fall away. Ancient homes were not silent in the way museums are silent. They were alive with layered sound. A sleeping compound still breathed. It held embers, stored food, tools waiting for dawn, and human beings lying close to one another under the same roof system that had sheltered the day's labor. Under such conditions, security and fragility coexisted. To sleep was to trust the house for one more night. Trust the beam. Trust the wall. Trust the weather. Trust the vessel to hold. Trust the fire to die safely. Trust the morning to return. And perhaps this is the most important thing we discover when we truly step inside a Han house. Its greatness did not lie in luxury, but in organization. The domestic intelligence of ancient China was not always spectacular to the eye, yet it was profound in practice. A courtyard for light and labor. Walls and gates for enclosure. timber frames for structure, eaves for shade and protection, wells for endurance, stoves for transformation, jars and granaries for time itself, mats and low platforms for a body trained to live close to the ground, pens, tools, and working surfaces for survival that never pretended to be cleaner than it was. None of this was accidental. It formed a civilization of routines, and routines repeated for generations became culture. This is why houses are never merely houses. They are moral technologies. They teach the body where to rest, the hand where to place objects, the child where to walk, the family how to share visibility, and the household what it means to endure together. In ancient China, the built environment did not only reflect order, it produced it. The compound was an argument in timber and earth. A good life is not improvised each morning from nothing. It is upheld by forms, habits, and structures that preserve human beings from collapse. So when we ask what houses were like in ancient China 2,000 years ago, the answer is richer than a list of materials or a diagram of rooms. They were places where climate, economy, family, and belief met every single day. They were inward-facing, but not closed to nature. They were practical without being primitive. They were capable of refinement without losing contact with labor. They could be austere, but they were rarely meaningless. Even the most ordinary house held a worldview inside it. The open center acknowledged the sky. The gate marked belonging. The stove joined nourishment and moral attention. The storehouse turned architecture into hope. The walls did not simply divide space, they guarded continuity. And this is why these homes still matter. They allow us to see ancient China not only through emperors, armies, roads, laws, and dynastic names, but through water drawn before sunrise, smoke rising from a stove, grain protected against rain, and a family moving through the same courtyard day after day. History becomes human again when it comes home. And if this documentary expanded your understanding of the ancient world, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and stay with us for the next journey into the ordinary spaces where civilization was actually lived.